Boston, 1995. The city had changed in the years since Mark Barrett was a boy, but in his mother's apartment, the air still smelled of cedar chests, mothballs, and time itself. 3 weeks had passed since Anna Barrett had died, quietly, without fuss, just as she had lived. Now it fell to her only son, 37-year-old archivist Mark, to sort through her belongings. He moved slowly through the wardrobe in her bedroom, carefully folding dresses whose fabrics seemed too delicate to touch. Some still carried the faint scent of lavender. Beneath them were boxes lined with tissue paper, hats wrapped in silk scarves, a pair of shoes that looked as if they had not been worn in decades. At the very bottom, tucked away in a small wooden chest, Mark found a bundle wrapped in linen. He loosened the string, unfolded the cloth, and froze. Inside lay a lace dress, yellowed with age, yet perfectly preserved. Resting atop it was a black and white photograph. It was unmistakably a wedding picture. A young woman stood in a simple gown, her eyes bright, her smile soft. Mark recognized her instantly. His mother, but not as he had ever seen her before. She looked radiant, almost like a stranger. Beside her stood a man in uniform, broad-shouldered, handsome, his expression caught between pride and solemnity. Mark had never seen him in any family album. This was not his father. He was a complete unknown. Turning the photograph over, Mark found only a date written in faded ink, April 15th, 1944. No names, no location, no explanation. Mark sat heavily on the bed, staring at the picture as though it might speak. His father, Michael Barrett, had passed away when Mark was a teenager. They had never spoken of another man in his mother's life, certainly not a husband before Michael. Why had she hidden this photo for half a century? Who was this soldier, and why had she never spoken of him, not even once? Questions piled on questions. Mark combed through the rest of the chest, hoping for letters, notes, anything that might explain. There was nothing. Only the dress, folded carefully, preserved like a relic. The silence in the room pressed on him. For years, he had believed he knew his mother. But this was a story she had carried in secret, one she had chosen never to share. And now, with the photograph in his hand, Mark realized that whatever truth it held had the power to change everything he thought he understood about her life. If this story moves you the way it moved me while writing it, give it a like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready. What comes next will change everything. The wedding photo lingered on Mark's desk like an unanswered question. Every time he walked past, he felt drawn back to it. The way his mother's smile radiated, the way the unknown soldier stood beside her with quiet pride. The date scrawled on the back, April 15th, 1944, pulsed like a secret code he was meant to solve. Mark began where he always did, with paper trails. His mother had kept journals, small leather-bound notebooks filled with neat cursive. They documented recipes, grocery lists, musings about her students back when she worked at the library, even reflections on Boston's snowy winters. But when Mark flipped to the wartime years, his heart sank. Between 1943 and 1945, there was almost nothing. A few scattered lines, a torn page, and then silence, as if 2 years had been deliberately erased. Puzzled, he widened his search. In the attic, stacked in boxes, were envelopes of letters, most written to her by cousins in New York or a friend in Chicago. They all skirted around daily life, ration coupons, church picnics, the war overseas, but there was nothing personal about a marriage or a soldier. The dead end gnawed at him. Then he remembered his great-aunt Margaret, his mother's older cousin, still alive in a senior home in Vermont. She was in her late 80s, her memory sometimes clouded, but if anyone knew about this photograph, it would be her. Mark drove north that weekend. The home smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Margaret greeted him with fragile warmth. When he placed the photograph in her lap, her hands trembled. For a long while she said nothing. Finally, her eyes filled with tears. "She called him Jan," Margaret whispered. "From Poland, I think. She met him during the war. They were married, but he never came back." Mark leaned forward. "Married? You're saying this really happened?" "She loved him," Margaret said, her voice unsteady. "But when he was gone, she locked it all away. She never spoke his name again." Driving back to Boston, Mark gripped the steering wheel tightly. His mother had lived with this secret for 50 years, and all that remained was a photo and a date. Determined, he turned to military records. He spent hours at the Boston Public Library, poring over microfilm reels and veteran archives. The soldier's uniform didn't resemble US Army attire. Its cut and insignia were different, suggesting European origin. After days of cross-referencing, Mark stumbled upon a possibility. The uniform matched those worn by the Polish II Corps, soldiers who had escaped Soviet camps and fought under British command in Italy. The thought stunned him. Could his mother have met a Polish soldier while working abroad during the war? He dug deeper. The American Red Cross had indeed sent young women overseas to support medical and communication efforts, and among their assignments were field hospitals in Italy, where Polish troops had been stationed during the spring of 1944. The puzzle pieces clicked. She could have been there. That could have been where she met him. Mark reached out to Dr. Marta Lewandowski, a historian at the Polish-American Historical Association. Over the phone, she listened patiently to his story. A wedding between an American volunteer and a Polish soldier wouldn't have been common, she admitted. But it wasn't impossible. Many such stories went unrecorded because soldiers went missing or because families back home disapproved. If your mother kept it hidden, it must have been painful. Mark sent her a copy of the photograph. A week later, she called back with news. "I think your man is Jan Nowak," she said. "Born 1920 in Lwów. He fought at Monte Cassino. Records say he went missing near Ancona in May 1944. Mark felt a chill. The name Margaret had spoken, Jan. The same year, the same region. He requested the official file from the British War Archives. When the scanned documents arrived, he opened them with shaking hands. There was an identification photo, grainy but unmistakable. The same strong face, the same eyes, the same man who stood beside his mother in the wedding picture. It was him. But the file contained one more line, one that made Mark's heart race. Reported wounded. Possible transfer to Allied Hospital in Naples, June 1944. He hadn't died, not immediately. He had survived, at least for a while. Mark stared at the file for hours. His mother had believed him gone forever. But what if he had lived? What if he had written? What if his letters never reached her? The silence in her journals, the lace dress folded in the chest, the April walks she always took alone. It all made sense now. She hadn't forgotten. She had carried him quietly every day of her life. Jan Nowak was born in 1920 in Lwów, a bustling city in eastern Poland, where church bells mixed with the sounds of street markets and the laughter of children. His father worked as a watchmaker. His mother taught at a parish school. He grew up believing in books, in hard work, and in the simple dignity of family. When war erupted in 1939, that world collapsed. The Soviets swept in from the east, the Germans from the west. Jan's father was arrested by the NKVD, accused of anti-Soviet activity, and vanished into the darkness of Siberia. And Jan, only 19, was forced onto trains with thousands of others, ending up in a labor camp in Kazakhstan. There, with frostbitten hands and an empty stomach, he broke rocks and wondered if he'd ever see home again. In 1942, fortune shifted. A political agreement between the Polish government in exile and the Soviets allowed for the release of thousands of prisoners. Jan was one of them. He stumbled out of the camps malnourished but alive, and from there he joined Anders' army, the Polish II Corps, forming under British command. They trained in the deserts of the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Palestine, Egypt. Soldiers who had known nothing but hunger were given uniforms and rifles, suddenly asked to fight again. Jan became a radio operator. His steady hands and quick mind made him invaluable. In 1944, the Corps was deployed to Italy, where some of the war's fiercest battles would unfold. It was there, in a field hospital near Naples, that fate intervened. Anna Barrett had volunteered with the American Red Cross. Fluent in German and French, she was assigned to communication work, but often found herself helping at the medical tents. One afternoon, Jan was brought in with shrapnel wounds to his leg. She tended to him, quietly, efficiently, until he made a joke about her bandage being too tight. She laughed. He grinned through the pain. For the next 3 weeks, they kept finding each other. In the mess hall, in the hospital courtyard, in hurried walks when the night was quiet. He spoke halting English. She tried bits of Polish. And somehow, between broken words, they understood one another. They talked about Boston and Lwów, about the lives they had lost and the lives they still wanted. War accelerated everything. With bombs falling in the distance, the urgency of time pressed on every heartbeat. On April 15, 1944, under olive trees behind the hospital, they were married. The ceremony was simple. A British chaplain, 2 soldiers as witnesses, and Anna in a lace dress she had borrowed and altered. A medic snapped the photograph that decades later Mark would discover. For a brief moment, there was joy. They were not soldier and nurse, not exile and foreigner. They were simply husband and wife. But war does not honor vows. 2 weeks later, Jan's unit was ordered north, toward Ancona. He promised Anna he'd return. He kissed her forehead, pressed her hands to his chest, and walked away. Then came disaster. On May 18, 1944, amid artillery fire near Loreto, his convoy was struck. Jan was thrown from a truck, severely wounded. He was listed as missing in action. For Anna, who never received another letter, it meant one thing: he was gone. But Jan hadn't died. He was rescued by a British patrol and taken unconscious to a hospital in Naples. For weeks, he hovered between life and death. By the time he regained strength, his unit had moved on. His mail had been lost. His records were confused. He wrote to Anna once, twice. He never heard back. What he didn't know was that, at almost the same time, Anna herself had been caught in a bombing raid. She was evacuated, devastated, believing him dead. She carried his child, but miscarried in the chaos. By the time she was shipped home to the United States, her grief had turned into silence. Jan, meanwhile, was resettled in England after the war. He never returned to Poland, which was now under Soviet control. He lived quietly, working in a factory in Manchester. He never remarried. He kept a single notebook filled with letters he could never send. On one page, Mark later read, "Her name was Anna. We married in the spring. She gave me hope when the world gave me none. If she believes I am dead, I cannot blame her for leaving me behind. But I will not stop carrying her in my heart." Mark set the notebook down, his chest heavy. His mother had carried silence. Jan had carried longing. Between them lay a love story cut open by history itself. Mark sat in his mother's empty apartment, surrounded by boxes of books and furniture awaiting donation. For the first time in weeks, he didn't touch the photo. He simply sat with it on the table in front of him, letting the silence of the room weigh heavy. That silence felt familiar now. Not just the hush of a space left behind, but the silence his mother had carried inside her for half a century. The notebook entries, the fragmentary letters, and the wartime files told him one side of the story, Jan's. But what about Anna? What had it cost her to live with that memory unspoken while building an entirely different life in America? He began to piece it together from small clues she'd left behind. In a box labeled personal, he found an old stationery sheet folded tightly, written in his mother's hand. The ink had faded, but her words were legible. "I don't know how I'm still breathing. I lost him. I lost our child. The war has emptied me. If I survive, it will be as someone else. Mark read it again and again, stunned. He hadn't known she'd been pregnant. The hospital records he later tracked down confirmed it. May 1944, Military Field Hospital. Complications due to bombing injuries. She had miscarried days after learning Jan was missing in action. It was too much loss for one person. A husband vanished, a child gone before birth, a future cut down before it had a chance. And then, no answers, no closure, just silence. She came back to the United States in late 1944. Family stories said she had seemed changed, more withdrawn, more careful with her words. She returned to her job at the library, went to church, smiled politely when people spoke of the war. No one knew the truth behind her eyes. In 1948, she married Michael Barrett. He was a steady man, a lawyer, who provided security and respectability. Their marriage was kind, if not passionate. For Anna, perhaps it was what she needed: safety, a chance to bury her grief and move forward. She never spoke to Michael or anyone about Jan. If Michael suspected anything, he never asked, but the silence had a shape. Mark could see it now. She avoided April conversations. She excused herself when friends reminisced about wartime romances. She never liked war movies, and every spring, without fail, she took a solitary walk along the Charles River on April 15th. As a child, Mark had thought it was just her birthday ritual. Now he knew it was her anniversary. He thought of her gentleness, her quiet strength, the way she had never shouted, never let anger surface. Was that patience? Or was it because she had already endured such devastation that nothing afterward could pierce her calm? He remembered, too, the piano in their living room. She played rarely, and when she did, it was late at night, long after she thought he was asleep. The music was always the same, slow, mournful, with a melody he couldn't place. Perhaps it was something Jan had played. Perhaps it was their song. Mark's memories collided with the artifacts he held in his hands: the lace dress, the photo, the note about their lost child. Each one confirmed that his mother's life had been shaped by a love story cut short, and yet instead of collapsing, she had carried on, quietly, resiliently, alone. In a kitchen cabinet behind a loose board, Mark found one more hidden envelope. Inside was a small photo, Anna and Jan together, standing under a tree, laughing. This wasn't the formal wedding photo. This was candid, alive, their joy undeniable. Anna's head tilted back in laughter, Jan's arm resting casually around her waist. She had never shown this picture to anyone. She had hidden it, preserved it, like a secret flame. Mark realized then that silence hadn't meant forgetting. It had meant protecting herself, protecting Jan, protecting the memory of what they had shared from a world that might never understand. He folded the photo back into its envelope, holding it gently. His mother had lived her entire adult life, carrying the weight of a story she never spoke aloud. A story of love, loss, survival, and endurance. And in that silence, she had taught him something profound. That sometimes the greatest strength lies not in what we say, but in what we hold close. Mark's journey to Italy began with a restless impulse he couldn't ignore. The photo, the dress, the fragments of his mother's silence, they had opened a door he couldn't close. He needed to see the place where Jan had fought, where he had vanished, and where his mother's future had been rewritten forever. It was late spring when he arrived in Rome. The city was alive with light and noise, Vespers weaving through traffic, voices rising from cafes, the aroma of espresso and roasted chestnuts drifting through narrow streets. But when Mark boarded a train heading south toward Cassino, the mood shifted. The countryside rolled past in green hills and scattered ruins, quiet reminders of battles fought 50 years earlier. The Polish military cemetery at Monte Cassino sits below the ancient Benedictine abbey, rebuilt after it was destroyed in the war. When Mark walked through the gates, the air seemed to change. Rows upon rows of white crosses stretched before him, the symmetry both beautiful and devastating. Each grave carried a name, a year of birth, a date of death, almost all from 1944. He walked slowly, reading them aloud, as if to honor strangers whose stories would never be told. Finally, he found what he was searching for, the memorial wall for the missing. And there, engraved in stone, was Jan Nowak. Mark's breath caught, his knees bent as if on instinct. From his bag, he pulled the wedding photo and placed it at the base of the wall. The faces of his mother and Jan stared back at him in the Italian sun, two young lovers forever caught in black and white. He pressed a small, smooth stone, one he had carried from the Charles River in Boston, onto the photo so the wind wouldn't take it. "She never forgot you," Mark whispered. "Not for one day." He stayed there for hours. The silence wasn't empty. It was alive with memory, with the weight of thousands of stories like his mother's. For the first time, he felt her presence not as mystery, but as truth. When he returned to Boston, he knew he couldn't keep the story to himself. He began writing, not as an archivist, but as a son. The article he produced, A Wedding in Wartime, The Love My Mother Hid, was published in a small historical journal, then reprinted in the Boston Globe. The response stunned him. Letters and emails poured in. Veterans wrote about their own forgotten comrades. Children of immigrants shared photos of family members who had married in secrecy, only to lose each other in war. One woman wrote, "Your mother's silence is the same silence I lived with my whole life. Thank you for giving it words." But one message from Chicago changed everything. "My grandfather served with the Polish II Corps," it read. "He often mentioned a soldier named Jan, who married an American volunteer. He wrote about it in his journals. I still have them. Would you like to see?" A week later, Mark flew to Chicago. In a small apartment, he sat with the woman, Emilia, who brought out a trunk filled with notebooks. Together they flipped through the yellowed pages until they found it, an entry dated April 16th, 1944. "Yesterday, Jan married a young American named Anna. It was a small ceremony under the olive trees. I've never seen him smile like that." For a moment, the war disappeared. Mark closed the journal slowly. Tears blurred the words. The story wasn't just family myth. It was real, witnessed, remembered. Back in Boston, Mark worked with the Massachusetts Historical Society to curate an exhibit. They called it Silent Threads, Love Stories of War. At its center stood his mother's lace dress, carefully restored. Beside it, the photo, Jan's service file, and excerpts from letters. Visitors lingered, some wiping tears, some leaving notes in a guest book. Mark watched quietly as strangers stood before his mother's story and saw their own reflected. He realized then that this was her true legacy, not silence but memory. She had carried it in secret. He had carried it into the light. It was late autumn in Boston when Mark returned to the Massachusetts Historical Society for the final week of the exhibit. Outside, the city moved briskly, commuters with scarves pulled tight, children crunching leaves underfoot. But inside, the air was hushed, reverent. The lights glowed softly on the displays, illuminating stories not just of war, but of lives interrupted, of love preserved in silence. Mark stood before his mother's lace dress, now suspended gently behind glass. Next to it, the wedding photo of Anna and Jan smiled back at him. For years, the picture had been hidden in a drawer, a secret she could never speak. Now it was here, witnessed by strangers, honored by those who paused long enough to understand. A young couple lingered at the display. The woman touched the glass lightly, whispering, "They look so happy." The man nodded, his voice low, and yet they lost everything. Mark swallowed hard. He realized that his mother's silence had never diminished the love. It had amplified it. It was a silence born not of shame, but of reverence. He moved to the end of the exhibit, where a guest book overflowed with handwritten notes. Some were simple, "Thank you." Others carried whole stories, lost grandfathers, Hidden romances, unspoken griefs. Mark skimmed them with quiet awe. His mother's story had become more than her own. It had become a vessel for others to pour their memories into. That night, back at his apartment, Mark placed a new frame on the mantel. Inside was not the wedding photo, but the candid one he had found in the hidden envelope. The one where Anna and Jan were laughing under a tree. That was the version of them he wanted to remember. Unguarded, alive, full of possibility. He sat at the piano, the one his mother had played so rarely. For the first time, he pressed the keys, letting the notes echo softly through the room. He tried to mimic the melody she used to hum late at night, the one filled with longing. Imperfect though his attempt was, the sound carried her presence. It was as though he was playing back her memory, note by note. He understood now that legacy is not just what we leave in legal documents or in spoken words. Legacy lives in the folds of time, in the objects we protect, the silences we hold, and the memories we choose not to erase. Anna had carried her silence as both shield and shrine. She had lost her husband, her child, and her chance at the life she dreamed of, yet she had lived, raised a son, given him love in the only way she knew. And when she left this world, she left behind a puzzle that, when solved, revealed not emptiness, but resilience. Mark felt no bitterness anymore, only gratitude. His mother had endured, and in doing so, she had given him not just life, but a story that would outlive both of them. What remains between the folds of time, he realized, is not just sorrow. It is love, transformed, hidden, but never destroyed. And now, a question for you. Do you have a photograph no one can explain? A letter with no name? A silence that lingers in your family? Sometimes the most powerful truths wait in the quiet until someone is ready to listen. We share new stories every day, true stories that move, inspire, and heal. Subscribe, leave a comment, and tell us, what story have you found hidden between the folds of time?